I'd like to welcome you to this panel discussion on predicting elections. This is a public event that's being sponsored by the Program for Economic Research, which is a research wing at the Economics Department here at Columbia. My name is Navin Kartik. I'm a professor in the Economics Department, and I will be the moderator for this evening. I'm delighted that we have a very distinguished set of panelists here with us. But before I introduce them, let me just say a couple of words about the topic, and then let them delve into the details. The word prediction, as some of you might be aware, comes from a conjunction of two Latin terms, pre, which means before, and dicere, which means to say. And I would guess that people have been interested in forecasting or predicting events before they actually occur, presumably since the dawn of mankind. We all make predictions of some sort in every aspect of our daily lives, from things as mundane to what will the weather be like today, will the subway be on time, will I get stuck in traffic, how long will it take me to get to work, and so on. These are obviously not very important issues in the larger scheme of things, and so most of us don't acquire fame or notoriety through making these predictions. On the other hand, there are domains in which predictions are extremely important, of course, and one of them is the topic for today, which is about elections. Elections are an important component of any democracy. Well-functioning democracies offer voters or citizens the choices, viable choices over different alternatives in which their opinions do matter. This could include things like choosing a president, choosing a legislator. These could be voting on a referendum, a ballot measure, and so on. And these, in cases like this, we care not only about what the outcome of the election actually is, but it's also important that we be able to predict this at some point in advance. Okay? And this matters for lots of reasons. Firms care about this in order to guide what kinds of investment decisions they make. This affects stock market performance. This matters for parties' campaign strategies. You even hear stories about how this affects people's immigration decisions from certain countries, and so on. Okay? Once you start thinking about this, there's obviously a host of questions that come to mind. How do experts go about making predictions for elections in particular, and predictions more generally for other matters too? Is there a method that's the best method to use, or should we be considering multiple approaches and multiple sources of data? How well do experts actually do in terms of their predictions? How do we measure the accuracy of expert predictions? How do we measure how well they do? What kinds of information should we be gathering if we want to improve the accuracy of forecasts or predictions as society? These are some of the questions that I think the panelists will be taking on today, and certainly things that we will be able to get into during the question and answer session later on. So, as I said, we have a very distinguished set of panelists. I'm thrilled that all of them have accepted to be here today. Let me briefly tell you a little bit about each of them. Nate Silver, here on my left, is the author of a widely acclaimed book, The Signal and the Noise, that I even just started reading and highly recommend to you. I actually gave it to one of my undergraduates today as a prize for a classroom experiment that we ran in class. Even if you haven't heard of the book, you probably have heard about his political website, 538.com, which is now hosted by the New York Times. Or you might have heard about his many contributions to the analysis of baseball statistics. With his success in correctly calling various political races recently, I think it's probably fair to say that he's become one of the leading public faces of statistics in general, and political forecasting in particular. To his left is Professor Philip Tetlock, who's currently the Annenberg University Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Previously, he was the Mitchell Professor of Business, Psychology, and Political Science at UC Berkeley, at the University of California. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and is the author of an award-winning book, Expert Political Judgment, How Good Is It? How Can We Know? I gather that he's been studying experts' predictions for more than 30 years now, and is surely one of academia's foremost experts on experts. Professor Justin Wolfers at the far left is a professor of public policy and economics at the University of Michigan. He was previously a faculty at the University of Pennsylvania. He's currently an editor of the Brookings Papers on Economic Activity. Many of you might have come across his numerous articles, both at the Wall Street Journal or on the Freakonomics blog at the New York Times. He's a leading scholar on prediction markets, which I'm sure he will be touching on today, and has explicitly researched different aspects to forecasting elections. Okay? So with that by way of introduction, I'd like to turn it over to the panelists. What I'd like to do is invite them each to speak for roughly 10 minutes or so initially in turn. And then after that, we'll open it up to question and answers. What I'd like to do then is initially pose a few questions myself for them to take on, and then after that, we'll open it up to the audience at large. Okay. The order that we agreed upon for the initial comments that they make is Nate Silver, followed by Justin Wolfers, and then Philip Tetlock. Okay. So let me turn it over, and Nate, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming today. This is, as far as I'm concerned, kind of an all-star panel of people who've done really terrific work in kind of bringing out the science in forecasting, both in elections more narrowly and more broadly. And I want to just speak very, very briefly at the top here in kind of a macro level, 30,000-foot way. So if you go and, for example, I've started to read the Harvard Business Review for some reason a lot. And if you read this magazine, there are some good studies and some dubious ones, right? But pretty much every other advertisement in the magazines about big data, that this term, that we have all this information now, it's become a very sexy topic. I travel around and talk to different companies and to different organizations. And it worries me when we have this new technology and people don't really know how to use it very much. It's a lot like my dad using Twitter, for example, where you get some good results, but if, I don't know if you guys follow my dad on Twitter, but there's a lot of noise there as well from from time to time. But if you look back at the work that Justin and Phil have done, prediction is hard, especially about the future. If you look at areas like economic forecasting, for example, like earthquake forecasting, like forecasting the spread of infectious disease, there have been a lot of false positives, so to speak, so a lot of failure to improve things. We have very little ability now to make forecasts still of economic growth more than about 6 months in advance. And so really, people want to tell the story about, Moneyball, where everything came together and now baseball's been revolutionized by stats. That story is only partially true for one thing, but also that's really kind of an exceptional case where in baseball you can define what it means to make a good forecast, where you measure success by wins and losses. There is some noise there is some randomness over the short term, but you have good incentives, you have a very competitive market, you have a lot of things in place that allow quantitative analysis to succeed there. In most fields, you have one or more limiting factors, and limiting factors is a polite way of saying that that we might have a lot of data, but we're still pretty dumb sometimes, I think. The second point is just the importance of prediction and forecasting to science in general. You can take the view that a theory is not scientific unless it's testable or verifiable. Prediction is maybe the easiest way to verify things. So I get suspicious sometimes when there are people who say, well, there are a couple things I get suspicious of. Number one is when someone will fit a model to past data that works wonderfully with the data that you're building the model from, but doesn't make predictions very well at all. There's kind of a class of problems called overfitting, for example, that produce false positives. This is a very serious problem with social science research, or just kind of scientific research in general. I think a lot of people don't really grasp that fitting a model is really a form of history, kind of in a quantified way, and not really a form of prediction per se. Prediction is most valuable when you are operating under actual uncertainty. When you say something, the word predict means you say something in advance, then you test it on an unknown piece of data. It's a very important part of hypothesis testing, and so it's something that deserves a lot more attention. And the third and related point is just that although we have a lot of data in a lot of different fields right now, we don't have a lot of data except for the work that people like Dr. Tetlock have done on how well experts are, on how well forecasters are doing the macro level studies of whether prediction is working or not, what techniques tend to work or not, seems like it's something we should be devoting a lot more resources to instead. Of course, there are various reasons for this, one of which is that people don't want to test themselves. I find myself, as I've had a reputation for more success, right, I've become a lot more cautious myself, so I understand those incentives, right? You don't want to kind of be goofy and put yourself out on a limb and predict the Super Bowl. People make fun of you if you get it wrong. But there's also a problem where people still see prediction as being kind of this mystical and mythical thing, where David Brooks, for example, referred to people who are using data to predict election campaigns as wizards, infamously. He's since praised Dr. Tetlock's work, so maybe he'll come around eventually. But it really is a type of science, a complicated type of science that we need to think about best practices in, that we need to train people in a lot more, that starts with probably better math and science education, where you focus more on teaching stats and probability, going all the way back to elementary schools and middle schools and high schools. It's a big problem, and so I'm kind of a near-term pessimist about how much progress big data will produce, and a long-term optimist about this being a part of technological and economic growth in the long run, but probably with some false starts in between. Even 538, for example, was seen as a example where we had a lot of success with taking data relative to elections, but the model that I use for 538 is in essence pretty simple, where it's just averaging the polls together and then counting to 270, meaning does one candidate have a majority of states in the Electoral College, and then trying to account for the uncertainty in the problem, how much error there is in the estimate. And yes, there is more detail than that. We'll talk about some of that detail, but even relatively simple systems like Real Clear Politics that just were taking an average of polls, they got 48 or 49, or in some cases 50 states right, as 538 did. And the fact that this was seen as so amazing, was so controversial, I thought was actually kind of a bad sign, really. Taking an average of a bunch of polls and saying that, oh, Obama's ahead in Ohio, he'll probably win, is not nearly as complex as forecasting the weather or the economy or how well a medical intervention might work or what we should do for our education system. And that caused so much consternation. I really kind of thought of it as a sign that we have a long way to go still. So hopefully tonight we can make a tiny bit of progress toward thinking about this in a more healthy and responsible way. So thank you.
Okay, Justin?
Great. So let me also be brief. I want to ask 4 questions. And I partly want to have fun occasionally at Nate's expense. So the first question is, why is Nate Silver so good? What can we learn from that? The second question is Nate Silver any good? Third question is, can you do better than Nate Silver? And then the fourth question is how we can, is really what's the future of polling and how we can do better. So why is Nate Silver so good at forecasting elections? He actually just described it. What he's doing is actually incredibly simple. It's based on, I think, 3 observations. Looking at many polls is better than looking at one poll. It's kind of obvious. Figuring out whether a poll is biased is better than just taking it at face value. It's kind of obvious. And polling's not the only information that we have, and so you need to take account of other information and uncertainty as well. It's also kind of obvious. In fact, much of what Nate's doing, and he's been explicit about this in much of his work, has been happening in political science from the early 90s onwards. Bob Erickson's here tonight. Bob was a pioneer in this. Andrew Gelman, also from the political science department. You can find much of the genesis of the 538 model in the work that's occurred in the political science department here. Why then is Nate such a wizard? And I think here, the big insight is Phil Tetlock's. It turns out everyone else is so bad. So Phil has demonstrated that experts are terrible, and so Nate figured out all he has to do is not be an expert. And so he follows the numbers rather than his gut, and the very, very simple rules of elementary statistics that I laid out at the start. And that's a huge insight. So all he has to do, I really think of Nate as basically demonstrating the flip side of Phil Tetlock's dictum that experts are terrible. All you have to do is not do what they're doing. And you can think about why experts are terrible, and here you put on the economist's hat. There are very few incentives to be right. And in fact, many incentives to the contrary. So the people you see on CNN are either raving Democrats who will always say Democrats are on the cusp of winning, or they're Republicans who always say the Republicans are on the cusp of winning, or they're pollsters who are always saying the Gallup poll will be right, or PPP polls will be right, or my poll will be right. No one's ever actually got much of an incentive to look at truth. They get very, very little feedback, political pollsters. So Nate started off by talking about big data, but election forecasting is actually a small data problem. We only get feedback once every 4 years. And if you get to run one experiment every 4 years, it's going to take you centuries to learn anything. The business model for polling is very, very different than the model for, say, picking stocks. Almost every pollster runs their political polling as a loss leader, as opposed to, say, Wall Street analysts who are actually trying to win money for their firms in some cases. And then I think the other thing, to Nate's great credit, is actually to do elementary statistics, you have to put together a database of polls. And you can't just download that off the internet. It actually has some real shoe leather costs, and he's gone out and done that work. And so there's a broader implication from his success, which is there are domains in which you can do a whole lot better than experts, because experts do a whole lot of dumb things. So then that's really the first question. Why is Nate Silver so good? We've got an answer, hopefully. Second question, is Nate Silver any good? Okay. Who here thinks Nate Silver is a fantastic election forecaster? Okay. Why do you say that? Have any of you actually gone through and put together a spreadsheet looking at Nate's projections and looked at the accuracy of them? And the more important question, many people say, oh, well, Nate got 50 out of 50 in the last election. That's really impressive. You know, with no math, no time, and no spreadsheets, if you simply said whoever won each state last election will win it next time, you would have gotten 48 out of 50. So Nate spent hundreds of hours for 2 extra states. The important question is not, is Nate any good? It's, is he better than the alternative? And trying to figure that out is really hard. And in order to do that, what we're going to need is lots of races where we can compare Nate to an alternative. So if we want to figure out whether Nate, let's assume that, say, Nate gets 80% of his calls right in close races, and each election cycle has maybe 5 close races, because most of them are really easy to predict, right? If you want to figure out whether Nate is better than the coin flip, you're going to need 3 election cycles to figure out whether he's better than just dumb luck. And he's only been doing this for 2.5 cycles. If you wanted to set a somewhat higher bar and say, Nate's really smart, he gets 80% of these races right, and Wolf is a bit smart, he gets 70% right, you'd need 90 close races to figure out whether he was beating me just by due luck. Okay? We get 5 close races every 4 years. That means we need 18 election cycles or 72 years before you can tell me whether Nate is better at predicting elections than I am. So round about the year 2100 is when we should be willing to crown Nate the king of forecasters. You know, the question here is Nate Silver any good? I think the right answer is it's really unknowable. So then, can we do better? So one of the things I've done a lot of work on is looking at prediction markets. This is just the idea that you can ask someone to bet, will the Democrats win the next presidential election? Right now, the Democrats are trading at around, a contract that pays $1 if they win the next election is trading at around 55 cents, so you might infer from that the Democrats are about a 55% chance to win. Now, I should also be the first to admit Democrats have their flaws. No, I meant to say prediction markets have their flaws. So do Democrats. And we see some pathologies in prediction markets. Sometimes they're a little bit too willing to bet that a long shot's actually going to win. And so my general advice to people who track prediction markets is any time the price goes below 10% or above 90%, ignore it, because there's not much information content there. Anytime the market's too thin, you should ignore it. And sometimes you want to take account of this favourite Longshot Bias. I had a graduate student in 2008 who collected prediction market data, and he also collected Nate's forecasts day by day. David Rothschild's his name. And for the 2008 election, he told me that the prediction markets actually beat Nate over many different time horizons. David hasn't yet done the update for 2012. Maybe you've had a look at it, Nate. You may well have had a comeback this time. But it does seem that certainly prediction markets appear to do very well. This election cycle, let me now get to the fourth thing, which is what is the future of polling? Here's the thing I'm most excited about. Nate's models are only as good as the inputs he feeds into them. The inputs he feeds into them are standard election polls, where you go out and you ask someone, who do you intend to vote for? When pollsters do that, I think they're treating polling respondents with very little respect. Think about how much information you know about the election. You know who you're thinking about voting for. You know the likelihood you'll vote. You know who your spouse is likely to vote for. You may have spoken to your in-laws. You may have been around the water cooler recently. You may have seen how many yard signs are out in your neighbourhood. You know a whole lot of stuff about the forthcoming election. What a pollster asks is only one small part of that information set. Who do you intend to vote for? Instead, they could try and extract a richer information set from you. They could ask you instead, who do you think will win? And in fact, a very, very little known fact is they've been doing that ever since the 1930s. And it turns out, we've put together this is joint work with David Rothschild, we've put together a database of polls where they ask both who do you think will win and who do you intend to vote for. And if you use the standard question that pollsters rely on, and indeed that Nate relies on, out of the 345 races we have, you would have gotten 69% of them right. If instead you relied on this completely different question, who do you think will win, thereby hopefully harnessing some of the wisdom of crowds, you would have gotten 81% of these races right. And we think what's going on is when we ask you who do you think will win, you're giving us some of the information from your broader social network. In fact, our rough guess, it's as if I'm treating each person I poll as a pollster themselves, and each of them has taken a poll of 10 more of their other friends. Now, this is actually really interesting for the future of polling. The worst possible thing for the worst thing that's happening to polling right now is people just aren't responding anymore. And it's becoming incredibly difficult to get representative samples of the US population. But if you ask people not who do you intend to vote for, but you ask them who they think will win, maybe it's not such a bad thing if you get unrepresentative samples. Because even if you asked all Republicans who they think will win, Republicans are a little bit too likely to think Republicans are going to win, but we can correct for that. But they're still giving us a whole lot of information about their social networks, which may themselves be quite unbiased. And so this may actually be a way of coming up with useful projections even when surveys turn out to be incredibly biased. Now, is this a technology that works? I think at this point, I'm going to invite you to make one of two choices. Either you say, we can't figure out whether this is a better technology because you need a whole lot of data, or you can say, well, let's test them and see how they did in the 2012 election. So what this method allows me to do, and allowed me to do, and I published this in the New York Times just prior to the 2012 election, my forecast, I was totally embarrassed, by the way. I looked at, throughout 2012, everyone always thought Obama would win. It was never going to be close if you looked at my question as opposed to the standard survey question. But by such a margin that I was forced to predict that Obama would win the election by 5 percentage points. When the computer spat that number out, I was like, done. This is going to be an embarrassing forecast. I'm going to turn there's no way he wins by this much. And just by way of comparison, Nate said he'd win by 2.5. Simon Jackman at pollster.com said 1.6, and Sam Wang from the Princeton Election Consortium 2.3. On election night, it looked like the number was bang on what Nate said. It actually turns out over the next 2 months they got around to counting all the votes, and people in New York and California vote a lot, as do New Jersey post-Hurricane Sandy, and Obama won the election by 4.25. So in fact, this method turned out in 2012 to be the closest of all of them. So let me conclude. Where to next? We have better forecasting methods than most prognosticators use, and Nate's shown that, and he's a great example of that. And I think the most interesting and exciting thing for you, and certainly this is what I tell my students, is what are the next domain in which there are huge gains? What's the field in which you can go out and be the next Nate Silver? So I read in the newspaper that Nate thought economics maybe was one of them, and I want to draw a distinction. There's two types of forecasting economics. There's forecasting what will be the non-farm payrolls number next Friday, like what's literally going to happen at the end of the week. And there we have hundreds of market economists with very strong incentives to get it exactly right, and I think that's an incredibly difficult thing to do better on. There's a different thing which is forecasting the economy, which is where's the US economy going to be 1 year out, 2 years out, and this is actually what's important. And it turns out our state-of-the-art models, dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium models that we teach our PhD students, barely do a better job, just a smidge better than just saying whatever happened last year is going to happen next year. And so it does seem that there is the possibility we could do a lot better on economics. The one that I'm most optimistic about is human resources. So my sister in Australia works in human resources, and I asked her once, how do you do your job? He said, Justin, the candidates just walk in, and I just look at them, and I know. And I said, how do you know if you were right? I just know. And there's never been a single case. She works at a leading HR consultancy, or did at the time. There's never been a single case when they went back and assessed whether her judgments were accurate. And if you think about this, this is actually exactly the Moneyball story. Moneyball is an HR story, right? And Nate actually made important contributions to that. But I think the same thing exists much more broadly in just about any of the tall buildings we see across the skyline. Beyond that, I think another domain that's very important, pharmaceuticals. The average pharmaceutical company is developing thousands of compounds. They've got great scientists doing that, but the firm actually really needs to decide which of these compounds is more likely to work out. That's a forecasting problem. What they do at the moment is they get the marketing people and the scientists in a room and they yell at each other. But this is a huge, multi-billion-dollar decision that doesn't have a lot of science. And of course, one can't help but look at the mess in Iraq and think that international relations is not another case where we could have done a bit better job with more formal forecasting techniques. Let me stop there.
Okay, thanks, Justin. Phil?
Well, in some ways, I feel I should allow Nate to respond. Anything you want to say?
Well, with it, look, in the long run, I would expect that if markets are efficient, then they can look at prediction markets are efficient. They can look at the 538 forecast and incorporate that along with anything else. I don't know if I literally agree with the conclusion of the paper about the 08 results, because if you debias in trade, I think this is a technical point, but if you debias in trade, meaning account for the favorite long shot bias, then I think it did better, but maybe not otherwise. But do you know what the biases are in advance is a trickier question. So for example, I think in general elections and many other contexts, you see the prediction markets have a long shot bias. So candidate who, say Walter Mondale in 1984, might have been trading at 5 or 10% on in trade if there were one back then, when his chance was probably 0.005% or something like that instead. In the Republican primaries, I think you actually almost saw the reverse issue, where you had candidates who were not given enough chance to have an upset. So I think Rick Santorum, for example, on the day before the Colorado caucus, was given only a 3% chance of winning the caucus, which he did. Part of it is that it's hard to, so say you have a candidate who's up by 5 points in the polls with the week to go, how likely is he to win? Your intuition for that problem is not necessarily all that helpful, and it matters a lot whether you're in the context of a primary or a general election. So kind of ahead by 5% in the polling average in, say, a typical Senate race with a week to go in the campaign, a November general election might have a 95% chance of winning. A candidate in a presidential primary, because the public opinion is much more unstable, the polls are much less accurate, might have, say, a 70% chance of winning instead. I think maybe in trade is not, you don't have enough sophisticated traders there to make those points of distinction, which are fairly clear if you begin to examine the historical evidence, but might not come across intuitively as much. So really I agree with about 99% of what Justin is saying, where really the fact that 538 was celebrated so much just kind of tells you how bad the competition is for the most part, especially in politics, where people have, I think, very perverse incentives, where ideology really gets in the way a lot of the time, where you've had a small and fairly insular journalism industry that only now is kind of changing, I think, very much at all. So it really helps to pick fields where everyone else is making a lot of mistakes, and you can look like a genius just by being kind of average, or give a B+ forecast and look like a very smart guy instead. So my advice to you is go identify sub-industries, industries where people are really dumb, and then be average, and you'll do really well for yourself.
Okay, Phil.
I'm the dinosaur. I'm the dinosaur on the panel here, and I've been running political forecasting tournaments for a long time. I initially got into the business in the early 1980s as the Soviet Union was approaching a critical transition point with Gorbachev, and liberals and conservatives, pundits, had very different opinions about different views of where the Soviet Union was heading. for different reasons. The liberals were claiming, for example, that the Reagan defense buildup was driving the Soviet Union toward a neo-Stalinist retrenchment. That was a common liberal prediction at the time. And conservatives were claiming that the Soviet Union had perfected the art of totalitarian cloning, and that there would be just an endless succession of gray suit, equally drab general party secretaries into the indefinite future. Then along came Gorbachev, and increasingly dramatic liberalization, 86, 87. And the interesting thing was that I observed back then was that nobody felt much of a need to change their minds. The liberals felt that, well, yes, of course, the Soviets are doing this because their economy is falling apart. It's happening despite, not because of Reagan. And the conservatives are saying, well, you know, I guess they hadn't perfected the art of totalitarian cloning. The Soviet Union, they blinked. Reagan pushed them, and they blinked. So each side, you know, saw no need really to change its fundamental assessment of the situation. And this post hoc or propter hoc sort of reasoning led me to start running larger forecasting tournaments in 1988, 1992, in which we asked lots of political experts lots of questions about countries around the world. Sometimes they involved elections, sometimes they involved economic growth, sometimes they involved wars and whatnot. And as Justin suggests, the performance was not very strong. The experts had a hard time. No, they did a little bit better than the dart-throwing chimpanzee. They did not. Most of them did not do better than simple extrapolation algorithms. You know, predicting essentially the status quo, which is, as Justin just pointed out, is a rather hard benchmark to beat sometimes in American elections as well. So that was the work that led up to the book on expert political judgment. How good is it? How can we know? And it's often identified with a rather pessimistic assessment of the quality of political judgment. More recently, I've become involved in a project under the auspices of the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Agency, in which the goal is less to curse the darkness and more to light candles. It's an effort to see how good political forecasting can become. And here I think Nate and Justin really do represent the future. When you're in this kind of a competitive tournament with other university teams, and you're trying to minimize the gaps between probability and reality year after year, you're pretty much forced to be very eclectic and opportunistic in the methods you use. So we were very eclectic and opportunistic about how the individual differences among forecasters that we study and how we weight those. We're very eclectic and opportunistic about the training materials we develop. We're very eclectic and opportunistic about where the prediction markets and the pros and cons of having people engage in competitive second guessing of each other's predictions and prediction markets, as opposed to more collaborative teamwork. So we're placing our bets on many different things, and many different elicitation methods, many different aggregation methods, many different training methods. And we're doing the best we can to minimize the gaps between probability and reality. And I would just say that when you look at the very best forecasters in the ARPA tournament, they have a rather Nate Silverish cognitive style. They're very methodical. They're quite modest. They try to identify the most plausible base rates. They try to identify Bayesian diagnostic signposts. They gradually update. Sometimes they move faster. Sometimes they move slower as a function of the news. But they're pretty good, and they seem to be learning over time to become better. They're becoming increasingly well calibrated. So on this panel here, Nate and Justin really do represent, I think, the future of political forecasting. Our best forecasters look a lot like, well, they aspire to be like Nate, because Nate's kind of a cognitive role model for them. One of the very best experimental methods we have for generating forecasts, it's not the best, and I could explain for various technical reasons why that may be the case, but are prediction markets. So prediction markets are a powerful way of bringing out the best from the best forecasters. So what we have here are, two I see essentially complementary approaches. Where we're drawing on both in various ways in the ARPA forecasting tournament, and it works. I think when you approach political forecasting, it pays not to have strong priors. It pays to be eclectic and opportunistic, and follow up on leads wherever they may arise. And that's what we're doing as we move into the third year of the IARPA forecasting tournament. And if anybody's interested in participating and seeing how well they can do, it's assigning subjective probabilities to a wide range of geopolitical events. There's a website, www.goodjudgmentproject.com. So if you'd like to visit that project and test your wits against the world, please feel free to do so. I think those are the major things I wanted to say. Why don't we just open it up to general questions now?
Okay, great. Perhaps I'll start with a couple, and then we'll open it up to others. So I guess one thing I've been thinking about recently as I've been preparing for this panel discussion is one thing that seems intriguing is to what extent people, be it voters or be it political parties, or might respond to the predictions that either you or other pollsters or predictors of other kinds make. So once sort of this really enters into the public consciousness that these predictions can be reasonably accurate, you might think that this affects how voters actually behave. So there's lots of evidence that many voters they have a preference to vote for winners, for instance. Or you might think that this affects just turnout decisions. If you gather that your favorite candidate is extremely likely to win in some state, why bother going to vote for him? And I was just wondering whether you sort of have views about how the fact that these predictions do become more accurate might end up influencing people's behavior. You might think it influences parties' behavior about how they campaign, and then sort of what that does actually to the accuracy of the predictions themselves.
So I guess I'd say, kind of thinking about this more broadly, I think media coverage can influence voting decisions, and maybe polling is a subset of media coverage, and what I do is a subset of that potentially. But you do see cases, especially when voters have some reason to behave tactically. So in the Iowa caucus, for example, a week before the caucus, you had Mitt Romney had his 20%, Ron Paul had his 20%, and then you had Rick Perry, Michelle Bachmann, and Rick Santorum all tied at about 10%, and they were very, very similar candidates. Most Michelle Bachmann fans would prefer Rick Perry or Santorum to Romney or Ron Paul. So you would think voters would have an incentive to get behind one of these conservative kind of Tea Party candidates instead, so they could win the Iowa caucus and remain viable in the race. But there's kind of no trigger. And then CNN came out with a poll, which had like a small sample size, like a few hundred people, that had Santorum surging all of a sudden from 10% to 16%. Now the margin of error is quite high when you have 300 people in your poll or so, but lo and behold, I wrote about this poll, and a lot of other media outlets wrote about this poll, and so what was probably an outlying poll became actual momentum. The Des Moines Register, which takes a larger sample size, probably a better poll than CNN, also found Santorum increasing from 10% to 15%, but they actually found that when they looked at their numbers day by day, it was tied apparently to the release of the CNN poll, where he jumped from 10% to 20% the morning after this spate of favorable coverage as a result of people having this cue to behave tactically instead. So I guess I do worry a little bit. I mean, if you do have people who are influenced by your prediction, it could potentially undermine your model. You'd rather kind of keep off the real world kind of hermetically sealed and perform your experiment on it, and then not have to worry about people reacting to it. But it does worry me a bit. I think it's the least likely to be concerned in a general election for the presidency versus primaries in cases, say, where parties are trying to allocate resources, where I know if we have, for example, an obscure U.S. House candidate, say a Democrat in Colorado, where we say, oh, she only has a 3% chance of winning, I might get angry emails from her chief of staff because that means that the Democratic campaign committees will donate to some other candidate instead, potentially. So that might actually make the predictions a bit self-fulfilling in a sense. So that can be problematic, I'd say, but I think that's true with any kind of campaign coverage. So it's not unique to this kind of thing.
Dustin, do you want to chime in about sort of the effects of prediction markets on these things? Or?
I thought Nate gave a splendid answer. There's certainly perception or a belief that my reading of the evidence, and here I would defer to others, is that how voters respond to information about how their candidate's doing is not quite as obvious as we economists think it should be. So if your candidate is doing exceptionally well, it turns out people like to turn out to celebrate the winner rather than stay home and look after their kids. The one thing I do know is that there have been, historically, there used to be very large prediction markets in the 1920s and 1930s in the US, literally on the curb at Wall Street, people betting millions of dollars. And Tammany Hall actually had a campaign chest to go and bet in these markets so that they would affect the coverage of the election. So what does that tell us? It doesn't tell us that prediction markets shape election outcomes. It tells us Tammany Hall believes prediction markets shape election outcomes. It's less clear to me that they actually do yet. Of course, the amount of scrutiny that forecasts get seems to me to be getting ever higher, and so that, you know, everything could change.
Phil, did you want to chime in there?
I would just say that Nate really went through the crucible. A lot of Republicans came to the conclusion that he was essentially working for the Democratic Party and trying to create a self-fulfilling prophecy of a Romney defeat. In the process, he revealed a lot of statistical illiteracy in the punditry. But it is a difficult position to be in when you're making predictions like that. And it's not widely appreciated how much more confident you can become when you aggregate many imperfect measures. It's somewhat counterintuitive for people.
So I guess another question I was wondering about is sort of where you see, aside from using polls as information, using prediction markets to in order to make predictions, sort of are there other sources? So there are interesting studies about social media, for instance. So there was a study in Germany, I think it was, that was talking about using Twitter messages in order to be able to make just the volume of Twitter messages in order to be able to make electoral predictions. And I was, I'd like you to comment on just where you see this going.
I mean, one problem is that if this stuff has only been collected recently, then it's hard to test it, to put it in a model with other things and see how well it might do. There is some evidence that Twitter, on the one hand, it, for example, seemed to indicate that Democrats would get a bigger bump out of their convention than the GOP did because they got much more favorable sentiment. On the other hand, the sample of Twitter users is a biased sample, biased in a statistical sense, where you have a lot more liberals than conservatives. You have a lot of very high information voters. So I tend to be a little bit skeptical. Also, keep in mind that within certain boundaries, polling is pretty decent late in the campaign, and that if you look at polling plus some notion of economic conditions, you can do fairly well. So the value of adding additional information at the margin, it's not necessarily easy to clear that bar versus a field where you're totally and completely lost. It might be more useful, for example, in the primaries, where the polling is not as accurate, where it's hard to find other measures that reliably give you predictive success. Then that might tell you more. But I think in general elections, I think it remains to be seen how much value it would add. On the other hand, by the way, internet polling, where Google would actually kind of randomly poke people if they're going to some site that had a paywall and say, hey, instead of having to pay for this paywall, why don't you take a poll instead? Well, the Google poll, that did really well. And other polls that were conducted online actually did better than traditional telephone polls this year. So I think that that's kind of more likely to be the game changer.
So let me add just two things to that. So again, I agree with Nate. When people talk about all this new social media data, and they talk about big data, they're confusing big data and small data. At the end of it all, if I say 57% of people in 2012 were tweeting in a pro-democratic way, that's one observation, even if there were 10 million people tweeting going into that. And you've got one observation in which you then have to calibrate, which is to say you need to take account of the bias that Nate was just talking about, which is how damn liberal are Twitter users anyway. By the time you've done the calibration, you've got no degrees of freedom left over and you can do literally nothing with it. And by next election cycle, 2016, you say, well, now I'll have two observations. Surely you can do something with two observations. Well, you could if you're willing to assume that the population using Twitter in 2016 is similar to that using it in 2012, which is surely a terrible assumption. The second observation I want to make is I think this actually does come back to Navin's previous question, which is he asked, how do forecasts end up becoming self-fulfilling? I think social media actually has a real possibility of doing that. Brendan Nynan, he's a wonderful young political scientist at Dartmouth who's become the self-appointed political science cop who goes out and he yells at journalists whenever they're committing sins. And to his eye, one of the great sins is they all sit on Twitter talking to each other during the debate about how the debate's going. And within 12 minutes of the debate starting, you can already write tomorrow's headlines. And so I don't have data to back this up, but if you actually just, beyond the story, but you watch the story, and Brendan's view is if you want to be a serious journalist, you should turn social media off, actually watch the debate that's happening, and then the next morning's headlines will at least be a sampling of 100 journalists around the country. 100 independent samples is a whole lot better reading than one sample from 100 of them sitting in a room talking to each other over Twitter.
Yeah, people don't, I'll just interrupt very briefly, but people don't know that, so I got to go to a debate in New Hampshire, one of the interminable GOP primary debates this year, right? But I'm like, I get to go to a debate, so I thought I'll go in the debate hall and kind of overhear what the common folk are saying, right? And instead, you're like literally put in a giant gymnasium with every other member of the political press corps, right? And everyone's talking out loud and looking at each other over each other's shoulders and kind of tweeting in unison. So I do think the fact that you've had both in the primaries and the general elections this year, the debates had more impact on the polls than they have in the past. And I do think you have a lot of groupthink there. I mean, if you want to study media bias, just as a general proposition, then study the reaction to debates. Like pretty much every form of media bias is present in the way that that debates are covered. Where, for example, after the third debate, you have people who were second debate, rather, people were saying, I think it was a tie, so Romney wins, right? It was like literally that explicit. But anyway, it's no surprise that groupthink occurs when you literally have an environment to cultivate it and have everyone thinking together, kind of in a room together.
Okay, let's perhaps open it up. So maybe what we could do is have people raise hands and then walk over to the mic over there, and I'll try to point accurately, and if you can walk over to the mic and ask a question, that would be great. Sir. And perhaps you could just introduce yourself for a second, just to tell us what your affiliation is.
My name is Paul Burke, I'm a Columbia graduate. So among all the pollsters that we see quoted in the papers or even on TV talk shows, there are some people that are identified as Democratic pollsters or Republican pollsters. I've never quite, first of all, the first question is, what does that really even mean? And the second question related to that is there a different incentive to be right? I mean, I'm thinking if I'm running a media for CNN or something like that, I don't really care so much if my pollster is ultimately correct, but if I'm running somebody's campaign, then I want that pollster to be giving me accurate information. So is there a difference in terms of accuracy and the kinds of information? Or maybe does that pollster give a different kind of answer when he's on TV than when he's talking to the person that's paying, writing the checks?
Well, so one way to define a Democratic pollster or Republican pollster is one that actually does work for campaigns, and you have some polling firms that do both. They'll have some polls commissioned on behalf of campaigns and some that they do privately. But aren't they all seeking that? That assumption that people care about the truth does not go very far, I don't think. And I mean, it's so obvious in a lot of ways, right? But we really are operating kind of a post-truth environment in politics a lot of the time, or maybe it's nothing new, but politics is the art of kind of manipulating public opinion in some respects and shading the truth, and so the ethics are very different. I mean, believe me, there are perverse incentives in academia as well, I'm sure, but politics is really toxic that way in a lot of respects. But one problem too is that journalists have a lot of incentive to put a lot of weight on proprietary information, whether or not it's reliable. So when you get the internal polls released by a campaign, for example, they're treated as being very prophetic, when in fact you can look at them and they are almost always biased in the direction of the candidate who puts out the polls by an average of about 6 points, in fact, on average, just way off the mark. If you remove that bias, it can actually tell you something some of the time, but not always. But when you get that inside information, then you're either getting it because someone's trying to spin, right, or because they themselves have become a little bit detached from reality. I think it's hard to in organizations. It's hard to be the bearer of bad news sometimes, and you have campaigns like the Romney campaign where the pollster is not just an internal pollster but also a public spokesperson for the campaign. Those are two very different and somewhat opposite roles, and I think campaigns that kind of keep their pollsters more isolated from one another. One thing the Obama campaign did in 2008, for example, they had multiple different pollsters. If you had disagreements, you could hash those out and maybe have a healthier debate about that. So I'm sort of kind of rambling here, but the first point is that when you hear about internal polls released by a campaign, that's usually a scoop that's not really worth anything. It's bullshit for the most part. And number two, that campaigns could certainly benefit from encouraging their pollsters to have better incentives, but it's hard to do in practice.
Phil?
I certainly agree with Nate that truth often runs a poor second or third to entertainment value and reinforcement of prejudices in consumption of political advice and punditry. But I think there probably is a price that you do that in-house Republican or Democratic pollsters would pay if they prove to be systematically wrong. So I don't know if it's true, but I've heard it said that Romney actually thought he was going to win.
I think
insofar as that is true, don't the pollsters who led him to think that aren't they going to pay some kind of a credibility price next time around?
There's definitely been a lot of talk in the GOP about how to reform their polling operations, and I think they are aware of it for the most part. When I talk to, and I try and avoid having too much contact with the campaigns, but I did talk to them at the convention, at the GP convention some, and at that point it seemed like the Romney polling team saw it more or less as the public polls did, which at that point had Romney narrowly behind, but you had a lot of time in the campaign still. You had a lot of uncertainty about what might happen still. Toward the end of a campaign is when the polls become much more reliable, and so that's when you might have the problems with denial, right? Where if you're down by 2 points in September, it means well, let's shift our message a bit and we can win. What's the big deal? If you're down by 2 points on election eve, you're probably going to lose that election 90% of the time, and it's too late to do anything about it, and so it might be harder to deliver that news to the candidate instead. But I'm sure Romney thought he was well, I don't know, actually. Romney certainly said he was going to win, but of course what a candidate has to say when he's asked by the press, what do you really think?
Well, the story, it might be apocryphal, is that he hadn't written a resignation speech.
I think that's probably bullshit. I mean, one thing that's funny about the press coverage of the campaigns is a politician who has a reputation for fibbing a lot, right? For some reason, the press always believes the most recent thing that he said, right? So Romney recently said, "Oh, the whole 47% comments, that wasn't the real me," right? It's like, well, why should we believe that now? Now of course he doesn't want to make himself look like a bad guy, but it's not always clear what the campaigns really think. I think you have people who are trained to spin the information in a way that presents it favorably, and I think it's hard to do that for a living and not buy into some of the bullshit yourself. Maybe if you're very good, but most people, I think, if they're in that paradigm, are going to become detached from kind of the objective reality.
Yep.
Yes. Since the economists failed to predict the recession, 2007-9, are they trying to resuscitate their image, or by going into this political area? Or, as you say, Mr. Wolpert, are you going to co-opt the methods of political science like Bob Shapiro's and develop your databases and then say it's, economic prediction?
So, here's a secret. No one in academia cares about forecasting. It's actually a completely accurate statement. I can say that as a practicing macroeconomist. I go to dozens of macroeconomics conferences each year. I see incredibly complex and elegant models with Greek letters I've never seen before. But almost never does anyone say, here is the fit of this model to the things you care about, and compare it to what actually happens. And in fact, I mentioned this very briefly before. The current fad within modern macroeconomics is an incredibly complex form of mathematical model called a dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model, which if you're a mathematician, you'll find incredibly elegant. And it takes, many of them take a high-tech computer 3 or 4 days to solve. Yet there's only been 2 serious analyses of the ability of these things to predict the future, and it's dreadful. And, you know, there's no market for doing that kind of research. And then the same is equally true, by the way, in political science, which is, you know, when I tell my friends I'm doing stuff on predicting elections, they're all like, oh, that's like political science, right? The truth is, there's maybe 3 or 4 political scientists I can have a serious conversation with about predicting elections. Bob Erickson's here, he's one of them. But there's not really, you know, and there's a few people who understand that if they get in this game, they can get their name in the newspaper every 4 years. But it's not really a serious part of the enterprise. And if it were a serious part of the enterprise, by the way, we wouldn't spend our time on predicting elections. It's not actually socially important. What would be more socially important would be able to predict, you know, what's going on with the regulatory process, what legislation will pass, things like that. Who wins or who loses? It's great water cooler talk, but I don't think it's actually that important. This is actually part of the reason Nate can be so successful. Those of us in the academy have no interest whatsoever in prediction. Which means a smart outsider can come in and do it better than the rest of us. And I think, by the way, some part of this is a flaw of the academy, which is, as a result, people think a smart guy like Nate can be better than modern political science, then they think modern political science may not be up to much. Well, they're off doing something else, but it's definitely bad for the reputation of the field, just as missing a major financial crisis was probably, at the margin, bad for the reputation of economists.
Why do you think it is that forecasting is not held in high esteem in either academic, economics, or political science?
That's a great question. I mean, you're in a discipline where it's taken somewhat more seriously.
Well, it's different. It's the study of expert judgment is different from actually forecasting.
Yeah.
Yeah. But go ahead. Do you have any thoughts about why?
That was a preamble leading up to me running out of words because I don't have a clue.
Well, one possibility is that academic political scientists and economists don't see the outcomes as being theory relevant. They think that the actual outcomes that do occur are occurring for many are occurring as a result of factors over which they have no control. That are often exogenous and that are often fluky. Mm-hmm. So they see the outcomes as having low diagnosticity vis-a-vis the theories they care about.
Right.
But you know, so I sometimes get this. I mean, actually, as Justin said earlier, you know, our models take into account a lot of the political science research. Where, you know, for example, there are models that have an economic component as ours does, as well as a polling component. But what we do is actually use, just like we use a polling consensus, we use a consensus of economic indicators, which helps you quite a bit. There's one model, for example, that is designed based on disposable income, per capita disposable income, and that stat has been reliable in the past, but it was kind of an outlier relative to other economic numbers. This past cycle, it was really bad, whereas the rest of them were just kind of pretty bad. And so models based on that variable did quite poorly, where those that use some kind of economic index, as mine did, or I think actually as Bob Erickson's does as well, they tended to do pretty well instead. But, you know, I mean, why do academics resist? Well, I guess the point I was going to make first is that, you know, if you say, well, this model's not grounded in theory, it's just kind of, you're just having fun and making a forecast, you know, my view is a theory isn't worth very much if it doesn't make good predictions in the long run. Of course, there are reasons that even, you know, that I've faced, academics face. You don't want to stake your credibility on one short-term outcome when you can't really test whether it makes good predictions in the long run or not based on, say, one election or something. But it's a way to avoid accountability, I think, in a lot of respects. You know, a lot of the theory, I mean, the disturbing thing to me is that in cases where we have been able to look at a lot of data and see how well experts are doing overall when it comes to forecasting, the result, with some exceptions, is generally not very good, right? And that's the stuff that we can actually test, and usually testability is a good criteria for science, right? So that means all the theories which aren't tested might be even worse potentially. So it's a little disturbing, I think.
Although there's one factor you're missing here, which is, so I have tenure. I could come up with the dumbest forecasts in the world. I could miss every financial crisis. I could get every election wrong, and I still have a job. If Nate does that, he gets fired. So then it's given those incentives, it's even more surprising that I'm not making more projections and Nate's not making less.
I mean, so there is another factor, which is just that forecasting economic issues in some ways is much harder than forecasting elections, especially when you get up close to the election, right? So, so you touched on this earlier. I mean, the predictions get more accurate as you get closer to the event, and I'm surprised that neither of you commented on that.
Sure. Yes.
Well, I mean, you know, there's a lot of noise in economic data, and that's a very basic thing where, you know, why is it hard, as Jessica was saying, to forecast non-farm payrolls? Well, there are a lot of reasons, but one is that there's a big sampling error, right? I think the sampling error alone is like, one standard error is like 70,000 jobs per month or something, and then so you'll have reports where it's like, the number's forecasted to be 130K, and it comes in at 110K, and it's like, oh, gigantic miss. Like, really? That's better than we do 90% of the time, or thereabouts, right? But people don't communicate that very well. And so, by the way, so there is a role here for reporters and kind of the media as intermediaries between academic science and between what economists are saying and what kind of lay people are doing. And often those messengers are poor messengers where you know, I think I've gotten like too much credit since the election, frankly. I think I would have gotten too much blame also if Romney had won instead. But they aren't necessarily communicating the science very well, and you have people who I guess kind of one basic conclusion of the signal and the noise is that the people who are the most confident are often the worst forecasters, but they often make the best kind of television guests instead, and so that can lead you even further astray.
We can understand why they're so bad at it. Imagine being a business reporter who wrote the headline, non-farm payrolls either went up a bit, a lot, or not very much.
Yeah.
Which is the accurate headline.
Well, and in general with news, I mean, a lot of time the accurate headline is, nothing important happened today, go watch the Yankees game and have a beer, right? You know, in the political campaign, you might have 2 or 3 really important moments during the course of the campaign. If you have a major economic shift or a war starts or maybe the first couple of debates. But for the most part, nothing much is changing from day to day, but you always have to fill column inches instead, so you really put an emphasis on the noise, so to speak.
Yes, in the back.
Hi, I'm an undergraduate in Columbia College studying political science and statistics, and this past year I worked for 2 different Democratic polling firms, one of which relied exclusively on online polling and the other one exclusively on landline phone polling. How do your models account for the variety in the medium of polling? And as technology moves forward, how do you think pollsters are going to be able to best reach voters?
So I'll give you the kind of literal answer for how the 538 model does it, which, as Justin said, if you de-bias the polls, meaning understand that Rasmussen polls are Republican-leaning or PPP or Democratic-leaning, then that removes some of the noise. But the question is what you de-bias it to. And I don't just use a straight average of all polling firms. What I use is an average of polling firms that use traditional telephone polling and call cell phones, right? You know, that's the kind of prior I'm introducing, but if you have a poll now where you don't call cell phones and you're only reaching, you know, roughly 6% of the population, then that's, you know, it's arguably not even a scientific poll to begin with. It becomes more almost like a, if you call random landlines, you get like a lot of 65-year-old women answering the phone. But literally, you'll have, you know, 70% of the sample sometimes if you call random digit dial landline phones will be from senior citizens right now because people under the age of 50 by and large don't pick up the phone anymore under many circumstances. They pick up their cell phones instead. They assume it's a telemarketer, and so that's a huge issue. So, you know, again, a lot of this is pretty basic. That the more you actually make an effort to go out and survey everyone and not just people that are easiest to reach, the better off you'll do. You know, we have now had landline penetration has fallen beneath internet penetration. That'll keep going up. So, I mean, I think you're obviously going to have more role for internet polls. I mean, what I hope you'll have, frankly, is I hope you'll still have some expensive polling done by the networks that uses calls landlines and cell phones and tries to get as many people as they can. And then you have internet polls to supplement that, and you get rid of these in-between robo-polls where you're taking just a landline sample in a really quick and dirty way. Those polls have not been very good by and large in 2012 and 2010, and they might get squeezed out, I think.
So I think there is a huge problem with getting representative samples right now. And so, you're right to say the non-cell phone universe, clearly not representative. The online-only universe, clearly not representative. Even those who try and bridge it, Gallup does both cell phone and landline. What no one tells you, and this is the truly dirty secret of polling, is what's going on with response rates. So in the 80s, we're up around 40%. Now it's down around 8 or 9%. So people who respond to polls are true weirdos. They're the 1 in 12 who wants to, for free, talk to a pollster rather than getting on with their lives. And they're the ones who are informing so much of our political discourse. So I have a prediction, which is sometime, and this is still falling. My prediction is there will be an election cycle in which we get a huge shock when we finally learn that, the final 5% of left are just total weirdos. And they're completely different to the 9% that we calibrated our models on from 2012. Now, the careful thing I did with my forecast here is, the old dictum, always say what or when, never both. So I'll never be wrong because it'll happen one day. But, even when Nate's really confident the day before his forecast, I was worried. What if this year we're down to 7% and 7% are wildly unrepresentative relative to the 12% that calibrated his models, and we've got no idea on that.
Well, one way the surveys can go wrong is indeed this issue of representativeness, and it is a looming crisis, as Justin suggests. Another way it could go wrong, and it's more theoretically interesting maybe from a social science point of view, is if self-report data are misleading. I don't know quite what you guys think about the Bradley effect, but there certainly were some social psychologists who suspected that Obama would win less of the vote, partly because of social desirability reasons. People didn't want to say they were not going to vote for an African-American candidate, but also partly because of unconscious biases to which people wouldn't have introspective access. Now the Bradley effect is controversial in political science, and I'm not sure what the latest views on it are. Nate, do you have an opinion about any of these? It could, in principle, have thrown things off, but it didn't.
I think the research had shown that it had dissipated, that this tended to be true in the 1970s and 1980s. If you had an African-American candidate, he would tend to underperform his polls. It hadn't been as true recently as much. One reason to think it wouldn't have been true in advance of the 2008 general election was because it hadn't really been true in the primaries by and large, where you'd had Hillary beat her polls in some states and Obama beat his in some states, but you hadn't really had any bias overall against Obama. So at this point, I think we're pretty sure that Obama won't underperform his polls. Maybe a different African American candidate would, but you do see it, for example, in some polls on gay marriage, where gay marriage ballot initiatives tend to do a little worse, the pro same-sex marriage side, than the polls suggest in advance. I think part of what's happening is if you have opinions shifting very rapidly, you might have a lot of soft support. So maybe in the 70s, when people would for the first time consider voting for an African-American mayor or something, or senator or governor, they kind of would say, yeah, I'll do it, but they weren't really comfortable with it. And you might have the same effect now with gay marriage instead, where people are like, well, I don't want to offend the gays, but then when you get in the polling place, then you behave a little bit differently. So I think it might be a sign of when you're rapidly moving toward greater tolerance or greater equality, and then once it becomes more commonplace, once Obama's been in your living room certainly for 8 years, then it dissipates.
So this brings me to a follow-up question, which is, to what extent is your strategy reducible to an algorithm, and to what extent are you engaging in subjective tweaks based on, well, here's a hunch about the Bradley effect, here's a hunch about this, here's a hunch about that.
We call our subjective tweaks our Bayesian priors. That's the no. You absolutely have to make a lot of judgment calls where, there are, so kind of before 538 for the last 6 or 7 election cycles, there have been a lot of models that are published by political scientists that use some combination of economic variables, polling-based or attitudinal variables, right? Sometimes variables indicate incumbency or war or whatever else. And I think in the 2008 cycle, there were 8 or 10 of these models that used like 23 different variables between them, right? So there are a lot of choices you have to make about, so for example, I think the principle is very strong that over the long run that taking a consensus of noisy data, whether it's polls or economic data, will win out, right? So even if I had found that one particular economic variable, and if you have literally 60,000 economic variables now at the Federal Reserve's website, of course you would find several variables that might do better than consensus, but I would still use the consensus index number instead because I think it would perform better over the long run. So you do have to make judgments like that, and hopefully they're informed by the kind of broader literature about what works in forecasting.
So there's an interesting body of work in psychology known as policy capturing, in which researchers try to create a statistical model of the expert. They try to create a statistical model that captures the cue utilization strategy of the expert. So you'd create a statistical model of a group of radiologists and how they make judgments, and then you'd compare what's more accurate. Is it the expert or the model of the expert in a cross-validation sample, right? So you could, in principle, do that with Nate Silver, too, right? You could have a Nate Silver and a model of Nate Silver, and we could pit them against each other. I think that would be a very
that'd be frightening.
That'd be an interesting contest, though, wouldn't it?
Nate shouldn't do that.
There is a macroeconomics literature that does that. So do you add judgment factors to the model? So most of these Wall Street guys have a principled model, and then they add judgments. And my understanding of that literature is that those judgments actually do improve accuracy.
The psychologists are more skeptical. The psychologists tend to find that the models outperform the experts from whom the models were derived. So the psychological literature is on that. But I think there have been a couple of exceptions to that. But I think the preponderance of the evidence is that the models actually do better than the original experts. Because the models are more consistent and the experts get more distracted by pseudo-diagnostic cues. Like you were saying during elections, there might only be 1 or 2. Now maybe you're really good at zeroing in on the truly diagnostic cues and discounting the pseudo-diagnostic ones. But most experts do get distracted, and the models don't get distracted by those things.
Well, I would say kind of in Joe's question of when should you account for subjective information and judgment calls. Of course, how you define subjective information is itself tricky, but that ought to be an empirical question, and you're going to have a different answer in different fields. I did a study of the baseball forecasting program we had called PACOTA, and compared it to the lists that were made by scouts, and the scouts actually, their judgment actually did a fair bit better, about 20% better than my system alone did. So that's a case where hey, the scouts are adding value, kind of contra Moneyball. There are other cases where maybe in psychology where that isn't the case, but that's why I say we need to collect data sets where we actually can evaluate forecasters and experts and see maybe there are some heuristics, kind of macro heuristics for when judgment tends to help and when it doesn't, but we don't even have that many case studies really to even know in a systematic way, I don't think.
Okay, let's take a couple more questions. So perhaps up front.
I'm an undergraduate at the University of Chicago, and I had studying econ and math, and I had a follow-up question about the econ prediction issues that were brought up. So I guess the first part is, so what do you see as Professor Wolfers and anyone else who has an opinion on this, what do you see as sort of the way forward here? Do you think we need to come up with a new dynamic equilibrium model, or do we need to forget that whole approach and start relying on some sort of prediction just based off of trend lines in our macroeconomic data? Do we need better data collection tools, and is that the main thing? And the second thing is sort of question about how we try to remove political biases from our economic predictions and our economic modeling, in the sense that I think that people's priors about economics are a lot more strongly held than their priors about, say, thermodynamics. And so when you become an economist and you take econ classes, that might not change your views as much as taking a physics class changes your views about, convection. So how do we try to, is there a statistical way that we can try to de-bias our economic predictions and de-bias and try to remove the bias from the way that we're constructing our models to begin with? Thank you.
Great questions. Let me take the second one first because it's easier. So you're very worried about the role of ideology in economic forecasting, and here I think you need to draw a sharp distinction between economic forecasters, the folks on Wall Street, versus editorial writers, the folks in the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal op-ed page has always been a political and politically contested place. Actually, even worse, it's not contested. And, there's no attempt there to de-bias. The guys on Wall Street, I'm struck by it. The chief economist, say at Goldman Sachs, Jan Hatzius, I actually have no idea which way he votes. All of the market forecasters who are actually doing the forecasting, they're a heck of a lot like Nate. A little better dressed. But they have a very, very strong truth motivation. The big bias, they have two big biases. One, they're overconfident, because it turns out the role of economic forecasters on Wall Street is not, in fact, to forecast the economy. It's to go to lunch with clients and be eloquent. And so effectively, they are sort of the paid entertainment. And again, you can't go to lunch with clients and say, the economy could go up, it could go down. The truth is we don't have a clue. So they oversell their stories. And the other thing is they don't change their mind often enough. And I have research, in fact, with Ricardo Reis on exactly this point. They will not change their story more than once a year, because if I say, it looks like the economy's strong, weak, new data came in maybe in between, now I look like I didn't have a clue what the hell I was doing, when in fact what I was doing was a completely rational way responding to data. So they don't change their mind enough. Your first question was much more challenging, which is how do we create an economics that forecasts better? I'm probably not the right person to answer, but I will give you my 1-minute spiel on this. I believe that the way we judge academic economics and macroeconomic models is very much on the grounds of elegance. Bob Lucas won the Nobel Prize for the rational expectations hypothesis that led to two revolutions. One was it fundamentally changed how we did macroeconomics, and the second, it led to an empirical literature in which people tested rational expectations, and there has not been a single paper written in that literature that found anything other than it's false. And so we have a great taste for elegance, and I think what we need instead is a truth motivation. And here I'm greatly inspired by behavioral economists who, it turns out, despite what Bob Lucas believes, most of us don't spend our days and nights dreaming about inflation, trying to calculate the optimal inflation forecast. Most of us are busy, we have other things to do, we make decisions based on imperfect information and often pretty bad judgments. And so if what we wanted is macro models that delivered forecasts that were true, they should be based on foundations that are true. And so I think have to pay greater attention to people's actual behavior rather than their imagined behavior.
Yes, over in the corner.
Hi, I'm an undergraduate at Columbia College studying political science. Our system, of course, is a first-past-the-post system. I was wondering if, in the business of forecasting and predictions, if we had also looked at different kinds of electoral systems, whether it be parliamentary list PR system or alternative vote or instant runoff system, and I guess most generally, if there are any methodological or findings quirks that we noticed that might be different that kind of bucked expectations, and then more on top of that, whether forecasts are less relevant for those kind of systems that suppose that there might be less of a need for tactical voting. And a lot of these systems, for instance, even in the UK, which is also first-past-the-post system, the election season is much shorter than the US election system, and how forecasting might apply to these other electoral systems, and whether that says something about our own that can't be generalized to democracy in general? Thanks.
It definitely makes my job easier when you have a two-way election. There are a lot of reasons why primaries, for example, are much harder to forecast than general elections, but one reason is that you have multiple candidates, so you do necessarily have tactical behavior. We tried to kind of do a forecast of the UK elections. I think it was 2010, and our model got a case of Cleggmania, I think, actually, and didn't do that well. But when you have shifts there, for example, where if you're not making good assumptions about what might happen if Liberal Democratic support collapses, where might it go? And it turned out that a lot of it went back to Labour instead of to the Tories. So that kind of thing where you have to make more assumptions, and it makes things a lot harder. But I think there are some constants. From my understanding is that the across a wide variety of contexts that economic performance matters and tends to help the incumbent party when the economy is doing well. But yeah, being able to have a two-way election is a lot simpler. In fact, in our models that I use, we treat third-party voters as the same thing as being undecided voters. In essence, it adds so much more volatility. Where if you have a race where you have a third-party candidate polling at 10%, there's a lot more uncertainty there. If we have a three-way race in 2016, then it's going to be a lot harder to model.
Okay. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Hi, I'm Tiffany Washburn. I'm a PhD student here in political science. I was a modeling analyst in the Obama campaign. A lot of what we've been talking about so far is the presidential election, which is a very luxurious place to be for a prediction market because you have so many polls, you have so many people who are interested. So I'm just wondering how your technology of choice would do trying to predict a smaller, lower information election, like say the New York mayoral race.
In general, the further you go down the ballot, the less accurate polling tends to be. But there are some nice things about working with congressional elections, which is that you have a lot more data points that are obviously you have some correlation in outcomes even in congressional and Senate races, but you can actually fit a model that might have, say, 6 or 7 variables, which I think our Senate model does, and not have to worry about it being overfit because you have 200 Senate elections since 1990 or whatever instead. So in some ways it's a more interesting modeling problem, although it's, you have to account for a larger margin of error in general. People have less information, decide later in the race. You also have more variance in candidate quality, where, for example, you had in the Delaware Senate race in 2010, you had Mike Castle, who would have won by 10 points, replaced by Christine O'Donnell, this kind of random, literally crazy person, pretty much, instead of an esteemed representative, and she lost by 15 points instead. Whereas a presidential nomination process tends to filter out the nutcases most of the time, except Barry Goldwater, but for the most part, you have pretty good candidates running for president, and so that means you don't have to worry as much about candidate quality, which are major issues when you're facing congressional or Senate races.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to persuade. This is a great opportunity because there are so many congressional races that I was saying before, you'll never be able to tell the difference between Nate and I till the year 2100. Well, if Phil would run a forecasting contest between Nate and I, where we have to get each of the House races right, then we'll have a large enough sample size. We'll know something useful here. Now, why is it we don't see much polling at the congressional district level? Because it's expensive. So I'm not particularly optimistic that prediction markets are going to be helpful. The biggest problem with prediction markets is getting people to trade in them. But the thing I'm more excited about right now is this idea of, instead of running standard polls asking people who they intend to vote for, asking them who they think will win. I believe that my prior on this is at the level of a congressional district, this will be a very, very powerful method. Because a congressional district is all about talking to people around the water cooler, seeing how many yard signs are out there, and so asking people in the district who they think will win. If we get the same turbocharging effect that we think we get, which is every time you ask someone who you think will win, they're sort of responding based on a poll of the 10 other people around the water cooler, then even with very, very small samples at each congressional district, if we turbocharge it by multiplying it by 10, we'll have effectively big enough samples to say something useful. So I believe in 2012, my co-author and former graduate student David Rothschild has managed to persuade Xbox to run some polls. And the great thing about that, it turns out lots of people play Xbox. And they asked not only who you intended to vote for, but also who you expected would win. And I believe they did it at the level of the congressional district. Those data are sitting on David's computer right now. But we hopefully, in the next few months, we'll be crunching those data and we'll actually be able to say, is this intuition right, that we'll actually be able to come up with good forecasts at the level of a congressional district. Just one small story. I went to Gallup with this idea. What you should do is ask people about, who you intend to vote for. And I said, what you should do is just ask this at the level of the congressional district. And, their response was, even at the end of the campaign, we're going to do 50,000 interviews over nearly 500 congressional districts, so only 100 per district, so all you're going to get is noise. And so this is pointless. To which my response was, but if those 100 people are each reporting on 10 others, then you're getting an effective sample size of 1,000 per district, in which this is great. This is a no-loss proposition. You can be the first guys to get congressional district polling right. So I think or hope we'll see some of that in the next cycle.
Okay, we started a little bit late, so let's go over another couple of minutes and take one last question. And by the way, Justin, I hope your student's going to correct for the bias sample with the Xbox.
I'm told it's representative.
Okay, yes, over in the corner.
So you've all spoke a lot about predicting an election from the outside. Can you give us some flavor of how the insiders, people working for parties, are using these techniques, and whether they are using them to tailor candidate choice and basically product choice for the candidates themselves? Thanks.
I would think that the insiders who are adding the most value are working with different types of data. So they're working with individual level voter results, where kind of the Obama campaign, to simplify, basically has a model of supposedly every registered voter in the country, where they have two numbers, which is one on a 0 to 100 scale, how likely are they to vote for Obama or the Republican, and one, how likely are they to vote, period. And there's a lot of modeling that goes into that. If you look at, for example, the data set from the 2008 exit polls, and you have 50,000 actual voters between the different states that were surveyed, so you can, it's a much richer data set than just looking at top line numbers instead. I personally think campaigns in presidential election cycles don't really benefit all that much from doing their own polling, really. This is one of those cases where you literally could kind of just trust the public polls in most cases, but they also have access to a lot of individual level data where we can identify relationships, and it's possible to make, to pick up on some noise in that as well, and you can overfit models and make other types of mistakes, but they have access to a lot more information than you get just by looking at the top line numbers from the Gallup poll or whatever.
I just make two observations. So one is, a lot of the polling they're doing is not actually polling in the sense of trying to come up with a forecast. They want to know which houses should we call on the week before the election, and if they've called you 3 months earlier and found out you're a staunch Democrat, then that's not forecasting, that's knowing. And the second observation, I am not inside campaigns enough to answer precisely your question, which is how do they use forecasts, but I talk to a lot of people in the corporate world, and I think the single best way of summarizing that is almost all corporations completely ignore all forecasts. And if any of you have an analyst role within a corporation, you can actually run the experiment, which is, come up with a crazy high forecast next month, and the following month come up with a crazy low forecast, and I bet nothing will change. And so this, in some sense, comes back to the earlier question, which is it's surprising time and again when I talk to executives how little of a truth orientation they have. The careers can be made by wearing the right suit and having the right cut of, having the right tie, and they're very rarely destroyed by bad forecasts.
It's an interesting question how much role there is for expert judgment in a world that is becoming as data rich as our world. Nate mentioned the problems with the UK election, for example. You could in principle have had polls that asked, that probed more deeply into where the Liberal Democratic vote was going to go, Conservative or Labour under various conditions. But it's very, very hard to anticipate all of the contingencies that arise in an election campaign and to work them into surveys and survey experiments and get feedback in a timely way. So inevitably, there is some role for expert judgment. You have to make assumptions about where things are going to go, and there, I think the parties would be well advised to check how well calibrated their experts are. One interesting thing about political judgment that's emerged from the IARPA tournament is that, I mean, you often hear it said that political experts or experts in general are overconfident. But when you create composites of expert judgment, the composites often seem to be somewhat on the underconfident side. So if you have 4 or 5 experts, each of whom has independent grounds for believing that the probability of a shift is 0.6, 0.6, 0.7, 0.6, 0.6. When you combine that, it turns out the best way to use that information in political forecasting is to extremize, which I think is consistent with what Nate does, but that gives a big boost to accuracy.
Okay, so I think we should wrap up at this point. The panel certainly held up to my predictions about how entertaining it would be. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. Sincere thanks to all 3 of you, Justin, Phil, and Nate, for agreeing to serve on it. I believe there is a reception outside that everyone is invited to, so we can continue the conversation over there. And I guess I'll just leave you with a quote that I dug up from the modern-day soothsayer, Yogi Berra, who apparently said that prediction is very hard, especially about the future. So, okay, thank you.